In the last discussion, we set up this background of science in general, kind of the reinvigoration of science in the late 1700s, 1800s, and again, some roots are even going back farther than that, back into the Renaissance. But biological science really is beginning to take off in the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. And there's been some ideas about changes among species. Lamarck comes along in the early 1800s and proposes his hypothesis about evolution, about how species change. And in this environment along comes a man named Darwin. Now, Darwin was a member of the privileged class, which most scientists at the time were. At this time, science was not really a paying job. It was something that if people loved it and were interested in it, and they had another means to support themselves, they could do it. But there weren't many scientists that were able to make a living being scientists. Darwin was the son of a fairly wealthy individual. He thought about, he wasn't the oldest son, so he wasn't going to inherit, so he needed some sort of job. So he thought about going into the clergy and actually was going to do that for a while. But eventually he gets convinced that he should be a scientist. And as part of this, he gets the opportunity to be a naturalist on one of these ships of exploration. So at this time, the British Empire was kind of in full swing, and there were ships that were going out exploring areas that at the time were not very well understood. So largely South America was still, fairly wild, and although there were many European colonies there, there were lots of wild areas. Southeast Asia and many other parts of the world were kind of unknown regions on the map. And so Darwin gets hired to be the naturalist on a ship. Now, the naturalist would go out at ports of call, so where they would stop, and would collect, sometimes for days or weeks, depending on how long they were stopped at these different areas. And they would collect samples and preserve them and store them into the hold and take them back, and then they would be either sold. There was a fairly large economy in being able to sell these things and be able to make money that way, and would be sent to experts and museums and would become part of the scientific collection in that way. And so Darwin begins doing this. The ship that he was on was the Beagle, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. They traveled from England, made a stop off the coast of Africa, and then made several stops along the coast of South America. And again, at each of these stops, Darwin would get out. He would get his jars and his nets and his collecting gear and collect samples, preserve them, store them, put them in the hold, and then they'd move on to the next place. And there are a couple of memorable and meaningful stops. We're only going to talk about two of them. The first is on the coast of Chile here. They arrived shortly after a fairly major earthquake. Now, Chile is right in a subduction zone. The Pacific plate is moving under the South American continent. That's what pushes up the Andes, and there are earthquakes quite frequently. This was a big one. And during this earthquake, the seafloor pushed under the continent and pushed the continent up maybe just a centimeter or two, but, enough that people could see. And so at the next high tide, organisms that previously had been just barely under the water were now exposed and beginning to die. And Darwin noticed this, and he asked about how often these big earthquakes occurred, and people said, yeah, we have earthquakes, but this was a big one, and these don't happen that frequently. And as he explored the Chilean coast, he noticed that up high in the foothills, there were marine organisms that had been fossilized, but they were now hundreds of feet above sea level. And he began to think about how long that would take. And so he realized that this was good evidence that the Earth was very, very ancient, much older than 6,000 years. And in order for these processes to have lifted up that high up into the mountains. So this is an extension of this idea of uniformitarianism, that the processes that are going on now were also the things that were occurring in the past. So he gets this idea and reinforcement of the idea of a very, very ancient Earth. Okay, stop number 2 that we are going to talk about is in the Galapagos Islands. And of course, this is by far the most famous stop, and Darwin now is forever associated with the Galapagos Islands. So while he was out and about doing his collecting, he noticed that the Galapagos organisms were very unique and different, but had some connections to the mainland. And he went from one island to the next and noticed that the organisms on one island were often different from the organisms on the neighboring island. And that together as a group, they were similar but quite distinct from what he had found on the mainland. And so this got him thinking about processes that might lead to these differences between organisms in these different areas. And so he started writing and thinking about that. The ship continues on. It actually circumnavigates the globe and makes other stops, but again, not as important for the history. So at this time, Darwin begins to think about and formulate what would become known as his two great laws, or general, the theory of natural selection. But really, natural selection is only half of it. Okay, so let's talk about these two great laws. He starts thinking about them when he gets home. He starts writing them down and begins to develop them, correspond with other people who are interested, and begins to develop these ideas. Okay, so his two great ideas are basically opposites of Lamarck's ideas. So number one is natural selection. Now, natural selection says that there is already diversity out there. And Darwin didn't know where this diversity came from. In fact, that was a major shortcoming, at least in his mind, of his theory, is that there's lots and lots of diversity, but he didn't know where that diversity came from. Now, today, of course, we understand that all that diversity originates as a new mutation. But what Darwin said is there's lots of diversity in species. We don't know exactly where it comes from, but we can observe it. And then he said sometimes that diversity means that some organisms will be more successful than others. And because of that, they'll survive better, they'll have more offspring, and so then the next generation, their traits, their characteristics will be overrepresented in the population. They'll increase in frequency. And so he called this natural selection. Sometimes it's called survival of the fittest. There are other terms. If you look at the readings for this week, you'll see another one that Darwin used, that was even used before Darwin, called the struggle for existence. But in modern terms, we call this natural selection. And so this leads to small changes in species over time that add up over long, long periods of time to great differences that can eventually make new species. Darwin's second main big idea was this idea of common descent, or that all species on Earth share a common ancestor. And he wrote about that. There's a very famous diagram in one of his journals, which is one of the very first phylogenies, where he's talking about these common ancestors that connect all species on Earth. Now, recognize that these two great laws, as they're listed here, are diametrically opposed. They're basically the exact opposite of what Lamarck was saying. So Lamarck was saying that traits acquired during life can be passed on. And Darwin said, no, but there's already diversity. Whatever's there is already there, but natural selection gets to decide which of it gets passed on to the next generation. And then Lamarck said that all species were independent and separate from one another. And Darwin's saying, no, they're all connected and they all have this history of common descent. And so this idea of common descent really is critical and is a foundation for Darwin's ideas. And so this has been built on and really has become a foundation for all science, all biological sciences. Now, Darwin develops this idea. He writes about it. He corresponds. He begins to kind of outline and even write a major book, kind of his magnum opus, what will be the representation of his life's work. And he does this for 20 years. So he's really, and he knows, one of the reasons he knows is it was going to be controversial. So at the time there was some, and even for many years afterwards, there was some pushback from cultural elements, particularly religious elements, that felt that this idea of a very, very ancient Earth, that species could change over time, was going to cause problems and was contradictory to their religious beliefs. And some of that was maybe misconception and misunderstanding of evolution. Others were really concerns. But for whatever reason, Darwin doesn't publish his work for 20 years. And he gets a letter in the 1850s, so mid-1850s, he gets a letter that basically outlines all of his ideas. Someone else came up with them independently. The name of this individual is Alfred Russel Wallace. We'll just call Wallace. So he basically comes up with these same two great laws, that all species share a common ancestor, and that natural selection is the mechanism that causes species to change over time. And Darwin at the time, of course, was very worried and concerned. His life work basically was going to be superseded or at least scooped by this person, Alfred Wallace. Darwin's friends convinced him that no, he really should get credit for it. And so basically he hurries, assembles, puts together his work, which he would call On the Origin of the Species, or just The Origin of Species. And he publishes it in 1859. And as he knew it would be, it was controversial. He does write about it, about Wallace, in the preface of the book, and he does give Wallace credit for coming up with it independently. So although Darwin is by far the most famous of the two, both Alfred Wallace and Darwin come up with these ideas of natural selection and common descent, and really they should both be given credit for them. Now, just so you know, Wallace did not have the privilege and money that Darwin had, and he was actually supporting himself by collecting specimens. He worked primarily in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in that area, and he would collect these specimens, save them, preserve them, ship them back, and sell them, and that's basically how he supported himself. But both Darwin and Wallace get credit for this theory of evolution. And so in his book, in his writings, and your reading for today is to read a little section. You don't need to read in a lot of detail. In fact, you can skim over it, but get a feel for it. Read what Darwin was writing. Read the preface. That's one of the readings I asked you to do in this book, and then the chapter on natural selection. And you don't need to read them in a lot of detail. There are 20 or so pages in each of those that I've asked you to read, but skim over them, get a feel for Darwin. And Darwin used tons and tons of examples. He used many in human breeding. Pigeons, which were a very popular hobby at the time, had been bred to all these different varieties and types. He used them as an example. He used natural examples over and over again. He has just mountains and mountains of evidence and examples to support his ideas. And so it was a very, very convincing book. And as scientists read this, as biologists begin to actually look at his ideas, most of them were fairly convinced rather quickly, and they begin to test his ideas and look at other examples. And so the Origin of the Species made a big splash. It was culturally a big event, probably the single most important book ever written in science, certainly in biology. But maybe even we could say this is the single most important book written in all of science. And it changed biology and was controversial, and there was pushback, and so really this is the foundation for modern evolutionary biology. One of the individuals who influenced Darwin's work during this period of 20 years as he is developing his ideas is Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus was not a biologist. In fact, he was a social scientist and philosopher. But one of his ideas that he was applying to social systems, Darwin realized applied to all populations, all species. And basically, his idea was that population growth is exponential. So we have 2 rabbits. Those 2 rabbits can have 5 babies. Those 5 babies each have 5 more babies. And we realize that that is exponential growth. And he was interested in human population. So he says human population has the potential to grow exponentially. However, the resources needed to support that population cannot grow exponentially because of limited space, because of other limitations on those. So whether it's food supply or clean air or just the space they need to live, those are finite resources. And although they might be expanded upon, we do not have infinite growth potential like there is with populations. And so Malthus was interested in what happened to societies when we reach a crisis point, when the human population outstrips the food supply, or when they're so crowded that we have, conflicts and diseases and things like that. So he was writing about the implications of this crisis point on human societies. But Darwin realized that that applied to all species. And so he realized that it was impossible for all species to survive, all individuals in a species to survive. And so some of them would be better at surviving based on the traits that they carried than others. And so this was the foundation for this idea of natural selection. So Thomas Malthus, although he's not a biologist, really is critical and important. And so you need to know his name and this influence that he had. Now, we're going to look specifically at the human population, and we're going to ask this question, right? What happens when we reach this crisis point, when a plant or an animal outstrips its food supply? Now, obviously, in nature, this happens quite frequently. And so we have large population booms and then die-offs. So inevitably, we're going to have a kind of a dynamic system. But even though we might outstrip, we might have a really good year with lots of grass, for instance, and you get 1 million rabbits, but not all of them are going to survive. Okay? Now, we are going to address this in the human context whether or not Thomas Malthus was right. And so here is a diagram estimating human populations. So we're looking at the green curve here. The purple curve is how fast populations are growing, the annual growth rate, basically birth rate. But notice that we had a fairly standard, although the population was getting bigger. In about the time Darwin was born, we had about 1 billion people on Earth. A little bit more than 100 years later, we had 2 billion. And then to get to 2.5 billion only took another 22 years. And then to get to 5 billion only takes another 37 years. So we do see this exponential growth. There's that exponential growth that Thomas Malthus was talking about. Okay? But where is the crisis point? You know, are we already now in 2019, there were almost 8 billion people on Earth, 7.7 billion. But notice something, that the growth rate has turned around. So as the population grew through the 1900s, people had more and more and more kids, but now that's starting to turn around. And so it's projected that the Earth's population, if current trends persist, and projecting into the future is always a sketchy business, but if current trends are the same into the future, we should top out at maybe 11 or 12 billion people total in Earth as people as people naturally reduce the number of offspring they're going to have. Now, this is interesting because in humans, we see a tendency to self-regulate, that when given the choice, when they have a certain standard of living, individuals choose to have fewer offspring. So we're going to come back and address this idea of a crisis point and whether or not humans have reached that crisis point or whether we will reach it in the future. And that's a complicated question, but for now we're going to leave this question open. Was Malthus right? And at the end of the next discussion, we'll come back and we'll address this, and I'll give you a brief overview, a partial answer to whether or not he was right about this crisis point, at least in the human population.